Morning, good evening and afternoon everyone from all around the planet and welcome to today's MaiaGrazing Scholars webinar titled Grazing Management for Targeted Animal Performance. My name's Cole Phelan, one of the executive team here at MaiaGrazing, and I'm joined today by Jim Gerrish from American GrazingLands Services in the US and Bart Davidson from MaiaGrazing in Australia. Be sure to check out previous MaiaGrazing Scholars webinars from our website where we've run them with Jim and other people, and also be sure to keep your eye out for ones in the future. Over to Bart Davidson and welcome again and enjoy the presentation.
Thank you, Cole. Welcome, folks. Okay, I'm going to be a bit like the teaser to the stallion. I think most of you are here for Jim, so I'm going to be just giving a very quick introduction to the larger topic of animal performance, animal nutrition, and a lot of beautiful stuff that Jim will be going into, just with a look at this through the prism of grazing management, which Jim will also be covering on. So I wanted to begin just by calibrating, because I think we often go past the basics in doing what we're doing. And the basics are that whether we're in Kansas or Dubbo or anywhere in between, we basically have a mental model for how our farm works. And it rains, it grows grass, we consume it, we breed, we fatten, we do what we do. We're in that mental model of this thing working the way we think it always has. And when it doesn't go to plan, it's because the season's gone backwards on us and we haven't actually got a plan for that. So we're going to focus a little bit on just making sure that we can deal with that. We've got a process for that, and we're not just focused on the animal or just focused on the grass. We've actually got a process and a focus on that process. So skipping into that, now this is a much bigger topic, and believe me, Jim's going to go into the depths of this. But just from my helicopter view here, from our perspective to start off, we're just going to say, right, well, animal performance is key. It pays the bills. It's the bit that goes to the overhead. We can't just sell grass, and even when we do just sell grass through adjustment or contract grazing, we're still ultimately demanding and needing to achieve good animal performance or optimal animal performance compared to what could be the case. And it's all about quantity, or it's a function, I should say, of quantity and quality in my very kind of broad layman's terms. So is the animal getting enough to eat? Usually it is. Usually it's a case of there being enough feed. It's just that the quality has fallen right away. And when we think about those things, we tend to think about supply and demand at the property level, balancing those needs of stocking rate and carrying capacity that we'll get into. And the quality focus really does tend to be more at the per graze, per day, who gets what level, and we'll run into that. But just in broad layman's terms, just to really break this down, I just like to think of it as pretty simple stuff, right? I've put beer in the garage. I've thrown a party. The quantity side of the deal is really trying to make sure that we've got a process for making sure that we don't invite too many people to the party. We've got big ones, little ones going to come along, the aunts and uncles, and we've really got to make sure that we have some sense of confidence that when we throw this grass party, that we can control that supply and demand, and therefore make sure that we have the right or an adequate supply of grass or forage quantity going to the animals that we want. And the quality, and I know that's a broad generic way of saying it, but it makes me feel good. In simple terms, the quality, on the other hand, is all about what's on the buffet, what's on the menu, who's going to get what, and have we got a couple of gate crashes that got in before the busload of visitors, and they've just taken out all of the high quality stuff that everybody else wanted to eat, and because they knew everyone else was coming, they've run it down. So it's all about who gets what and making sure that there's a process around that, and just being really clear on that, because if you look at that photo on the right there, we've got some dairy cows that most of us would be, not that familiar with in our day-to-day beef or sheep jobs, but we don't see the heifers there. They're a different party. this is the high quality party for the 30 litre a day milkers. The heifers are somewhere else, the bulls are somewhere else. And it's a really classic example of how managing quality is such an important part of the deal, because in that particular system, the feedback loop is immediate. So let's just think about that, that equation of who's coming to the party and making sure that we've got enough for them. And it's really boiled down to stocking rate to carrying capacity, which is described in different ways by different people, but essentially it's about matching supply and demand. It's essentially about getting the balance right between what's coming on and the demand that we put on that. And this chart is a fantastic example of that we generate in Maya, that really does highlight how hard it is to keep stocking rate to carrying capacity about right. And I don't just mean on Tuesday and Wednesday, I mean for November, December through to the end of next year. And it tends to be a bit of a rock and roll because the seasons, as I mentioned earlier, don't always go to plan. And we're certainly experiencing that through most of Australia at the moment. And I know the States has been on the flip side of that, but it's a hard thing to get right. And it's essentially all about thinking through our numbers so that we can get to this point. And I'll just make the point that whilst the focus tends to be on quantity, is there enough feed when we're overstocked? No, the answer is no. We're also having an impact on quality because we're running down the factory that produces the energy and the things that and the matrix of quality that Jim will be pointing at, and we're running down the capacity of that grass factory to produce higher quality in future and be responsive to the season. It's also true that when we're understocked and often overgrazed per plant, per acre, per paddock, per hectare, that we're also leading to a rundown or a degradation in overall feed quality or forage quality, because we're reducing the selection pressure and giving competitive advantage to the species that we don't really want, and we're hammering the daylights out of the species that we do want. And the key goal here is to get to that right-hand side of the chart where we're tracking, where we've got stocking rate to carrying capacity in pretty close measure out into the future, because that's going to help us control both the quantity, or manage, I should say, the quantity and the quality of the feed, and have a process for it. So how do we do that? Well, let's just really take the mystery out of this and think it through, right? It's not that hard. We're just tracking actual grazes. Maybe we're moving Monday to Tuesday to Sunday. Maybe we're moving every day with high density, long recovery grazes. Maybe we're actually set stock. It doesn't really matter in terms of the record. It certainly does matter in terms of the grazing management and the outcomes of that on all the things that we're talking about here. But ultimately, if we track the grazes, when they start, when they finish, which paddock, which pasture they're in, we've got some great records. If we track the inventory then, and the ups and downs in the total inventory, the animal units, which is really as simple as the ups and downs in head count and dry matter intake, forage going down the throat, then we've got the data that's going to drive demand calculations. We don't have to do any more ourselves. Tools like Maya can do that for us. And the third part of the equation is really pretty basic. It's just the precipitation, because that's the magic ingredient that drives the forage production out in the paddock. So taking that through for the past and the present beautifully allows us to think about the future without actually bending our brains too hard. And that's the beauty of maths, and that's the beauty of algorithms, and that's the beauty of what Maya's been beavering away at doing on the path to where we're going. And the point is that Maya does it for you. You can do it on the back of a piece of paper, on a Graze chart, on a calculator, in an Excel, but it'll basically do you in over time. And it needs to be simple. So we need to be able to see the likely future. We need to be able to see the assumed conditions being transferred into supply. That's essentially what we're talking about here. We're taking past actual demand and converting it to expected supply for the paddocks, paddock groups and property that we're dealing with here. And we typically are dealing at a property level. So we can do this at a sub property level as well. Maybe it's the river country versus the hill country, but it's a beautiful thing, and it can't be understated the value of that single chart in front of us there, where we've gone from being out of control, either understocked or overstocked over a period of time, wasting grass or impacting the future capacity of the forage system to respond to precipitation. And there's untold amounts of stress and strain in that, and we've seen that in Australia this last probably even 18 months now. But it's also the case on the other side, coming out of drought and going into wetter times, that the confidence in decision making is often lacking in the absence of this. And I can honestly say there's been marriages saved, banking relationships maintained, and family partnerships maintained because of that ability to take the angst out of the decisions and work out how to go from overstock to carrying capacity. And it's crucial. So moving on then, that's at the farm total level, and the allocation of feed then becomes our focus, because we've just looked at so far at the property level or the ranch level, how are we metering out supply and demand. What matters now is the quality, and that's the teaser to the stallion that Jim's going to get into. But it's really about that buffet that we were talking about before, and how do we manage the buffet at the grass party, because that's where the money's made and lost. Yes, getting stocking rate to carrying capacity is absolutely crucial. It's where businesses are made and lost, but it's at the allocation of feed, who gets what level, that we really see the difference in margins and the difference in profitability. And that's where the sexy part is. So the problem that we're trying to solve is not rocket science. It really is who gets what and when to maximise animal performance. Seems so simple, right? And so many farms and ranches have got mixtures of age and stock class, animal value to the business. And it tends to be ad hoc, and it tends to be how we do it, and it tends to be how we've always done it, and it tends to be part of that first slide I put up with the mental model for how this farm works. You know, we move the lambs, then we move the weaners over that part of the farm at that time of year. We join over at that part of the farm. But that doesn't really account for the change in seasonality and the fact that feed and forage quality often changes within pastures as much as it does across pastures, across the property through the year. It's a moving feast. It's a moving matrix. It is a beautiful thing, but it's a tough thing to manage. So we've therefore got to have a focus on process, and we can't just let it be ad hoc, because that's where the money is, as we'll see very shortly. So, I guess the key underlying points to that are that we have to manage for a plane of nutrition. Too often we've seen businesses that are grass-fed finishing, or on the latter end of a supply chain to a feedlot, doing all the hard work on the genetics, doing all the hard work on the supply chain, and doing all the hard work on management of the various factors that go to running that property, but then falling apart and going from really great average daily gain, weight gain, falling over and taking 10 days to pick it back up because the plane of nutrition fell over, because the movement of stock from this feed to that feed wasn't thought through. And even with good operations, it happens all too often. And most of the time, I'm going to say, it happens all the time in operations that aren't thinking about these things, and the cost is unknown. It's completely lost to opportunity. And it's a big part of the deal. So my point here is that grazing management is linked into both being a result of these other factors that Jim will talk about, the mineral, the energy, the protein, the fibre, those core component parts to what stands the plant up and differentiates this beautiful grass over here to that poorer grass over there, both as far as how the livestock smell it, feed it, and convert it, as well as how we see it in a lab test, in a forage test. But it's also the case that how we graze that material can affect its quality. And that's pretty crucial. And we're not going to get that through luck or ad hoc process. It's actually got to be, or ad hoc luck, I should say. It's got to be through process. And I just put this in because, yes, I love numbers. Yes, I love see these things visually, but this is our experience. You know, we could have chosen a 400 kilo animal or a 1,000 pound animal. I've just picked the typical steer that goes to a feedlot. And let's not forget, right, the reason we have feedlots around the world, much as we may not enjoy spending time there, is that they fill the gap. Finishing on grass is hard work. We know that from experience. We know that because it's actually hard to get this right. That's why it's so important to get the process right. So here, all I've done here is just say, right, let's take that 350 kilo steer that usually goes to the feedlot, or the 770 pound steer, and roughly enough, don't argue with me about the intake, it will vary slightly around their performance here, but let's just say they're taking in their dry matter as 10 kilos or 22 pounds per day, and they're taking the best they can from the best that they've been given. And just to make the point, you know, if they were in a feedlot on unrestricted, unrestrained quality, and not walking around, by the way, and not expending much energy, by the way, then they'll be doing 2 kilos plus or 4.5 plus pounds per day. Averages tend to be a bit lower than that, but they can certainly do double that as well, which means that, and I've also seen that out in the paddock too, by the way, or we've seen that out in the paddock. And that means if you convert that across, 2 kilos down the throat or 4.4 pounds down the throat means that for every unit going in, I'll say that again, for every 5 units going in, kilos or pounds, we're getting 1 unit out, a kilo or a pound of beef, lamb, whatever it is that we happen to be growing. Let's just say it's beef. So we've got a very high conversion factor. And in all the work that we've done, we'll typically see grasses achieving at best 6, 7, maybe 7, 8, 9, 10 to 1 conversion of feed, dry matter to that meat output. But then, which is good, but most people aren't measuring that for a fact, right? And when we know what our stocking rate is and we know what our weight production is, we actually can calculate that, and it becomes very valuable, particularly if you know the cost of your grass or the value of your grass. Because you then see that that same animal that may well have, well, probably did cost us exactly the same amount to rear and get to the point where we're doing this. If it's on low quality feed, which is not unusual because we haven't got our management processes into place and we haven't got that structure around who gets what and when, that animal's going to do anywhere back down through those numbers we can see here to, you know, around about 0.25 to half a kilo or half a pound to a pound per day of average daily gain. And you can quickly see that, you know, whilst that's the number that might get bandied around at the pub or at the tavern, if I'm at Kansas, then there's a big blowout, you know, by a factor of 8 in the efficiency of the conversion of that dry matter into the product that we sell that pays the overheads and everybody else on the farm with the same animal. So the quality seriously matters, is my point. It's not to be taken for granted, and we all know the animal will take care of what they need. If they've got the buffet in front of them, they're going to take the quality that they can to the extent that our grazing management lets them, which is then where we've got to start getting serious about managing for grass, managing for landscape, managing for animal, managing for plane of nutrition, managing for recovery, and all the things that go with it, which brings me into the back end of this. And you know, at a very basic level, this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to climb the hill of the growing season, putting feed in the bank, in the reservoir of our property. And on the way through, we need our grazing management to build that residual each time we come through with a rotation or a selection, and build up that reservoir of feed to the extent possible before it turns off, and we then begin the downhill slope to the other end of the non-growing period, whether that's 1 month or 8, and a bit like a controlled descent in a plane without any power. We want to hit the ground in a controlled way, not getting all smashed up and running out of feed too early, which happens way too frequently. So on the way up, we've got to manage that process for both recovery, timing, timeliness, managing the phase of growth that Jim will talk about, and attending to quality as well, because we've got to make sure that the heifers are getting the feed that they need to do their growing versus what the old cracker cows are going to be using with all of their teeth to help us do a landscaping job as we come behind. So it's a moving feast, but essentially what I'm saying is that this is happening whether we're conscious of it, whether we're managing for it or not. And that's the beauty of having a process system underneath that. So that takes us to the Graze plan, which has been around since Noah was a boy, just in different forms. MaiaGrazing as a tool for the way up on the growing season, and we have a tool for the way down in the non-growing season with the feed budget. And I won't bog in the detail of that, but essentially just for those folks that haven't come across this, and for those that have, and then lose the mojo and the discipline to keep it going, this is where the difference between a farm making that margin and not will usually be, in our experience, when it comes to animal performance. If you're running a high revving machine, you know, a Jaguar of a farm, maybe even a Ferrari of a farm, if you can't attend to who gets what and when in an appropriate way or the best possible way, then you're going to leave money on the table. And it really does come down to the basics of selecting the period of time that we're talking about, you know, which part of the year it is, what's happening, growing, non-growing, warm, cold, raining, not raining, selecting the animals. It's usually by class or a combination of classes in a group of animals in the herd or the mob. And then rounding up the appropriate feed for them and thinking about it and arguing with our son or arguing with our brother or the foreman about exactly how this should work, because this is where it's so critical to maintain the plan of nutrition for an animal going up, and to be thinking about who can do the job for us on the landscape of cleaning up after we send the young growing stock through, and the sequence those paddocks need to be in for that to occur, you know, because it's got to be practical, right? They've got to go from here to there. We can't just magically send them on the other side of the farm. We've got to have this sequence of movement so that we optimize that. And we've got to enter our assumptions around quality and quantity. And then we've got to modify it till it works, because there's no point in having a plan that tells us straight up that we're over allocated like this one here is. And then we've got to follow it and we've got to refine it and we've got to take it as a given that it's dynamic and something that changes and gives us something to talk about at the kitchen table. So, excuse me. The result of that is where I'm going to wrap up. The result of that is that we've actually got a list then that we can look at. It's not ad hoc. And yeah, we can talk about it at smoko and dinner time with the rest of the team if there is more than just us. We can think about the results of actually sending the cows that way and the steers this way, and the result of that when we do the next way. And it just gives structure to how people are thinking about what they do. And it's a very, very simple thing that, as I say, has been around since Noah was a boy, and has been a calling card of holistic management for so long that is just so underutilized as well. And the beautiful outcome of that is that without actually doing much extra work, or no work in fact, if we've done those preceding steps, then we end up with a record. The plan becomes the record that we can pull out of the back shelf next year, next decade if we like, and remember what the yield was, remember what the recovery periods were, and then see the trend through time of both pasture yield, pasture recovery, density achieved, and ultimately the animal performance off those in these different coloured mobs and herds that we've got here. So I'm going to throw now to Jim. I'm going to say that this is a big subject, and I had actually had some grand intentions of doing some boisterous animal performance data dive, and I set myself the goal for that in this webinar, but I fell well short because I actually found that I needed 10 hours for every one that I put in to get to the result that I actually wanted. So I'm going to do that next time and build up to it, because it is actually a much bigger topic than most of us appreciate. So just in closing, stocking rate, you can see it there, it affects both quantity and quality. And quality is seriously important. It's significant to animal performance and how we manage for that, therefore, in our grazing management, and how we plan those grazing moves and the allocation of feed impacts quantity and quality, because they're interlinked. The grazing animal is a tool as well as the recipient of our past efforts. And ultimately, I think my closing point is that time and time and time again, those that make the money, those that do avoid the stress and strain, and those who love what they do will typically be commonly easily identified as people who plan this stuff. It doesn't happen by chance. So I'll love you and leave you there and throw to our man, Jim.
Thanks so much, Bart. I'm not Jim Gerrish, it's Cole again. While we're changing the over to Jim's slides, I just thought I'd just reiterate that we've got a few questions coming through, so keep them coming through and we'll answer them at the end to the best of our ability. Also, a bit of a shout out to Justin down in Kansas. Thanks for reaching out over the chat. Looking forward to lining up that MaiaGrazing personal one-on-one demo with you tomorrow. And if anyone else wants to do that, please just drop us a line via the website to take your personal guided tour through MaiaGrazing. It may be for you now, it may be for you later. We're more than welcome you to reach out and we'll share what we can. I'll hand over to Jim now. I can see his slides about to maximise. So I'll come back in at the end for questions.
Okay, thank you, Carl. And thank you, Bart, for that great introduction. And Bart did a nice job of covering that. He talked about the quantity and quality of feed. And I'm going to put a little more on quality tonight, as opposed to just quantity. So when we did the last session on this webinar series, I talked about creating excellent pasture, and going to review in just a few slides here what is excellent pasture and how do we go about getting it. So excellent pasture, I say, is high in energy. We're going to see that more often than not, it is the energy content of the forage that is limiting animal production. Even though there's a lot of emphasis put on protein, in a cool season forage environment, it's actually fairly hard to get to a protein deficiency state. In contrast, in warm season grasses, we do have to certainly be managing for the protein content there. Minerals are essential for healthy metabolic function and immune system in animals, and for their growth and overall performance. So we'd like our pastures to be mineral rich. Part of the way we get mineral richness is through broad species diversity. We want the forage to be palatable, and we want the pastures to be durable. And we emphasize that excellent pasture doesn't happen by accident. It's our management that creates excellent pasture. In contrast, horrible pasture is not the natural state either. That was created by someone others' choices or lack of choices. But our job is to try to create productive, high quality pasture. The management objectives that we are focusing on to get to that excellent pasture include maximizing photosynthesis, which helps us optimize the energy flow to microbes in the soil. We try to create biodiversity above and below ground. We want to build organic matter in the soil. We want to have functional water cycles and nutrient cycles. The management strategies that we emphasize in using to accomplish this are short grazing periods, balancing use and recovery periods. We leave appropriate residual after every grazing. A pasture before we come back to it again. As I said, we're striving to broaden the biodiversity in the pasture, which leads us to healthier, biologically active soils. When we create those excellent pastures, and if you only get the very good, don't lose hope. I actually go to very few excellent pastures anywhere in the world. I see a lot of very good pastures, but the excellent ones are really few and far between, but that's what we're striving for. When we get the pasture to the productivity level, the yield, the quantity that we want, we can start working on the quality of the pasture. We need the animal, we need our livestock to harvest it. And the choice of animal that we use to a large degree should be dependent on the type of pasture we have, the environment we're in, and then of course what our market opportunities and our lifestyle choices are. So when I think about livestock and what they need, I'm generally looking at it in terms of what are the energy requirements. We're going to sort our various enterprises on the basis of the energy requirement. Now I'm going to be using the term TDN, total digestible nutrients. That's one of the measures we use in the US and Canada. I see it used some other places in the world. We could have done this on the basis of the net energy system, where we look at net energy maintenance, net energy gain. To me, the TDN is a simple system to express this. Part of it is because these numbers are just kind of ingrained in my mind. And so I refer to them quite frequently. So when we're thinking of animals having very high energy requirements, they would include lactating dairy cows and nannies. And of course, with the increasing popularity of sheep cheese and sheep kefir and things like that, I should put dairy producing ewes in there also. Ewes and nannies nursing twins and triplets, and then finishing beef animals in the beef sector, trying to produce high quality, finished grade, what we would consider USDA choice to prime grade meat. That is the highest energy requiring animal in the beef sector. And as Bart said, doing proper grass-fed beef is not an easy task. It is hard work, and part of that hard work is creating this high energy forage. So when I think about these types of animals, I would like their dietary intake from the pasture they're grazing to be putting forage with a TDN greater than 68% into their bellies. We have the high energy 68%, lactating beef cows, finishing lambs, and growing stockers at a rate greater than 2 pounds or approximately a kilogram per day. We have moderate energy, which requires 54 to 60% TDN. And I hope you realize that if you're towards the lower end of these TDN ranges, you are going to be towards the lower end of the performance levels that I'm specifying. So for moderate energy, we have late lactation beef cows, replacement heifers and ewe lambs, and then stockers gaining from a half to 1 kilo or 1 to 2 pounds per day. When we come to the low energy animals, 50 to 54% TDN, usually we're talking about dry pregnant adult animals or stockers that would be growing cattle to yearlings at a rate of gain less than a pound a day or a half a kilo. What we often would refer to as roughing them through the dormant season so that we can take advantage of compensatory gain when the green grass rolls around. So that's how I break down the forage into their capacity to supply energy to animals. We will come back to it later, but I want to emphasize at this point that almost every pasture contains some finishing quality feed, some growing quality feed, some maintenance quality feed. We don't necessarily need to think of a pasture as being all or nothing for one class of livestock. We can use leader follower, or some people would refer to it, first and second grazers. We can use various strategies to allocate only a certain amount of the pasture to a particular class of animal. When I say that almost every pasture has some finishing quality feed in it, you might look at these two pictures here and says, well, there ain't none of those pastures. But you know what? If we went in with our finishing animals and asked them to only consume 5 to 10% of that standing forage, we could probably achieve finishing rates of gain, get those animals to marble, even in these dormant season conditions. It's all about the level of choice that we're going to let those animals select for. So what really drives animal performance is daily forage intake. Here's basically what it's about. The more you eat, the fatter you get. One side of the grazing intake equation is the actual mechanics of grazing. The time animals spend grazing, how many bites are they taking, and then the size of the bite. Research in many, many different countries, many different settings has basically shown that cattle will spend 5 to 10 hours per day. If we have ideal forage conditions, cows are going to take about 15,000 bites in a day. If we go into a short grass situation where we're asking these bovine to graze more like a sheep or a horse by biting directly down on short forage, they're going to increase their biting rate. And the degree that they can increase it might be pretty shocking, in excess of 45,000 bites per day. But what we'll see at the end of the grazing day is that 45,000 of those little sheep bites that those cows are taking are never going to stack up to the total volume that that cow takes in, taking 15,000 of those big bites where she can extend her tongue, pull a wad of forage to the mouth, and shear it off. That is how cows, bovine, optimize their intake. Sheep on this same pasture where we see these cows would perform very well on it. There's a difference in the mechanics of grazing. So what happens if we have such low quality forage that the time needed for rumination exceeds the time available for grazing? You've probably heard that cows are unionized. They graze 8 hours, ruminate 8 hours, and rest 8 hours. Well, that's not perfectly accurate, but it's fairly close. The higher the quality of the forage that the animal initially ingests, the fewer hours that animal has to spend ruminating. And if they spend less time ruminating and the rate of passage of forage through the animal is greater, guess what? They can eat more. And if they eat more, total forage intake goes up and individual animal performance goes up. In a situation like we see this, protein may in fact be the limiting factor. There may be adequate energy in that grass to support that animal's maintenance, but if there's inadequate protein and rumen function breaks down, then we have a real problem. If we put sheep out in those perfect grazing conditions, they'll meet their needs in 6 to 8 hours a day. And typically in these kind of conditions, they'd be taking about 40,000 bites a day. When we put them on shorter pasture, they can not only increase their biting rate, they can also increase the hours in the day that they will spend grazing. This is the ability of the sheep or the goat with the smaller mouth, with the ability to work with the lips and tongue and select off individual leaves from plants, whether it be short grass like this or thorny brush. The sheep will select a higher quality diet than a cow will in almost any situation, and they have the ability to maintain a higher level of intake on a pasture that a cow would starve on. Then we look at horses, and horses can graze in excess of 20 hours a day. Horses are not ruminants. They do not have to balance their time in the day between grazing and ruminating. This is what makes horses the most destructive animal that we can put out on a pasture rangeland. It is their ability to graze throughout the day. When we come down to it, and we really want to manage this forage intake, through our management choices, bite size is the thing that we can mostly control. We know from, again, many research studies, and we did a lot of this when I was on the University of Missouri faculty. back in the 80s and 90s, we did a lot of this type of research of measuring daily forage intake on pasture with animals. And what we found is bovine will maximize their intake with sward heights between about 6 and 15 inches. So that's about 7 to 40 centimeters. Look at it statistically and look across an array of pastures. You may have had different standing forage in, anywhere from, say, 1,000 pounds per acre, which is for all practical purposes 1,000 kilograms per hectare, up to 4,000. What we found is that the pre-grazing herbage mass, how much forage was standing there in the field, when we looked at the variation in intake among those herds grazing all those different pastures, we found only 23% of the variation in intake was explained by the pre-grazing herbage mass. 82% of variation in intake is explained by the post-grazing residual. In other words, almost every stockman can look at that pasture on the left side of the fence and say, oh, this is a great pasture, I need to put my cattle in there. Sadly, most of those same stockmen don't know when to take the animals out of the pasture, and so they end up with reduced intake, disappointing performance. And as Bart said, what really separates the profitable enterprises from the struggling enterprises is that issue right there. The people who are profitable know when to get the stock out of the pasture and keep intake high and animal performance high. The quickest and easiest way to increase intake on pasture is just be willing to waste a little grass. Leave a taller residual, intake will go up, individual animal performance will go up. So when we were doing our intake work, we found on cool season pastures, intake was explained about 75% by availability, only 25% by quality. This goes back to this basic principle that cool season forages, whether we're talking grasses or legumes, tend to be much richer in protein than our warm season forages. It's hard to mess up the protein availability in a cool season pasture. On the other hand, in a warm season pasture, it's 50-50. It's an even split between managing for availability and managing for quality. So if you're in a predominantly warm season environment and you're trying to achieve animal performance, you need to be paying a lot of attention to the growth stage, the maturity of the available forage, because it's going to be the protein availability in that forage has to be adequate to maintain rumen function so that the animals, the grazing animals, can digest the fiber and extract energy. This is some work done by Ed Rayburn when he was at Cornell University, and it compares the relative intake of sheep and cattle in the same pasture situation. So 100%, when we talk about relative intake, that 100%, that is the maximum capacity of the rumen to expand and take in forage. There's very, very, very few enterprises that we ever manage for maximum individual intake. Grass-fed beef, the highest quality grades, is about the only enterprise where we manage at that level. For the most part in commercial enterprises, we're really managing at about 80% plus or minus relative intake. This is that stocking rate to carrying capacity balance that Bart was talking about. If we push our stocking rate beyond the land's carrying capacity and each individual animal's intake is being restricted because they have less forage to choose from, we see performance crash. And that's in this example, this work from Cornell, which is in New York State, so it's the northeastern US for those of you not from the US. You see when that intake level drops below 80%, that is when we see performance crash. We see the gradual decline from the maximum intake down to about 80%. But when we push our stocking rate beyond the carrying capacity at that point, individual performance crashes and we cannot pay the bills. Now this graph here, this is more intake work that we did in Missouri. And we're looking on the vertical axis, we have the daily intake as a percent of animal live weight. And on the bottom axis, it's the number of days in a grazing period. So we did this, when we did this research, we looked at continuous grazing or set stocking, weekly rotation, 3-day rotation, daily rotations. I'm only showing the one from the weekly rotation because it's the most interesting one. It is the most dramatic illustration we have of what happens to an animal's intake in a particular grazing period when we've tried to put the stocking rate to meet the carrying capacity, but what we find is the animals let into a new pasture will really binge graze. They will have extremely high intake for a couple of days, but after a couple of days of grazing, they have taken off the highest digestibility and highest protein forage. They have reduced the volume of available forage, so we see their intake go steadily down. That red dotted line at 1.9%, that is the maintenance level. So we see these cows, we're rotationally grazing them on an orchard grass-alfalfa pasture. We think their performance should be fantastic, but we're very disappointed in it. And why are we disappointed in it? Because by the second half of the grazing period, they're eating at maintenance. And by definition, eating at maintenance means there is no productive function in the animal taking place. That's from the animal's perspective. This is from the same study, but it's looking at the data in a different way. What we did here with all of these pastures had about 3,400 to 3,600 pounds of dry matter per acre. So that's about 3,500 kilograms per hectare. And we looked at how much of that forage could the animal utilize 1.5% body weight intake rate, which would be a moderate level of performance. And what we see on animals that we were rotating every day, and I want to step aside and emphasize, this is in the same type of pasture with the same availability. If we grazed it on a daily rotation, we could use 2/3 of the available forage and maintain the intake target. If we were rotating them weekly, though, we could only utilize 1/3 of the forage and expect to get the same animal performance. You know what that tells you right away? You can run twice as many animals on a daily rotation as a weekly rotation and expect the same individual performance. And now, is that always absolutely true? No, but that's what the data in this case clearly illustrates. All right, I already mentioned that increasing the biting rate will not compensate for reducing the size of the bite. We do not want to put bovine into the position of grazing this type of forage unless we're very low performance. This is a maintenance or a less than half a kilo, less than a pound a day rate of gain. They simply cannot consume enough forage to do any better than that level of performance if this is the state we're looking at. So if we have going into pastures in this kind of growth stage, we want to leave at least this much forage behind. That's a 4 to 5 inch residual, what we would call a phase 2 residual. That's good for the plants, it's good for the soil, and it's also good for individual animal performance. If we take it down to this point, a lot less leaf area, more bare ground exposed, it's bad for the plants, bad for the soil, and it's going to be bad for livestock performance. Not only in the sense of reducing intake, but when we start asking animals to graze down to this level of residual, that is when they start picking up parasites again. On that previous slide, they're grazing above the parasite layer. This is one of the easy guidelines that we use. Are these animals getting enough to eat? It's called eyes to nostrils. If you can see the nostrils of an animal when it's grazing, its intake is probably being reduced due to low volume of forage. If you can't see their eyes, the intake is probably being reduced because the forage is over mature and we have lower digestibility. We can still get performance with animals in a pasture like this, but we might only be asking them to eat 20 to 30% of the available forage, not 50 or 60%. This is what the optimum level looks like. We want to see their eyes, but we don't want to see their nostrils. The other piece of the intake equation is, of course, what is the nutrient density of that forage? The energy, protein, minerals, vitamins, other factors. What is available in that forage to meet the animal's nutritional demands? What we really want forage to be is something that tastes great and is more filling. Bart used his reference to beer at the family gathering, so there's my anti-light beer commercial. Tastes great, more filling. All right, so the number one factor that drives forage quality, just quite frankly, is plant maturity. As an illustration, when we think about cool season grasses, for each day past boot stage, and boot stage is just before that seed head comes out. The last leaf, the flag leaf, has appeared, but we don't see the stalk. For each day past that, the typical ryegrass, fescue, cocksfoot, those type of grasses, they lose 0.5% digestibility per day. Now, digestibility, remember TDN was total digestible nutrients. Digestibility and TDN are very closely linked. You remember that we said high energy pastures were greater than 68% TDN. And then the bottom side of our high was 60% TDN. If we had a pasture that was at 68% TDN, so it is high quality, 16, 17 days later, it's going to be into the medium quality category. That is how fast grasses change. This is, again, why when we have that explosive growth in the spring, it seems animals very quickly lose interest in eating that stuff. It's because of that declining digestibility and rate of passage through the rumen is slowing down. This is a field from our irrigated pasture here on the ranch in Idaho, and the temporary fence running through there, I had grazed side about a month earlier, and so we have recovery there. And what's on the left side of that fence is beef finishing or dairy quality feed. What did not get grazed a month earlier and was allowed to grow for another month, what's over there on the right side of the feed is basically maintenance quality feed. We did run cow-calf pairs through there about a month before weaning, and we compared those calves to ones that were more typically grazing what's on the left side of the fence versus grinding through 30 days on that maintenance quality feed. It cost us 40 pounds in weaning weight over that 30-day period. That's about 18 kilos for those of you who don't do pounds. Maturity of the forage, huge, huge factor. Species also makes a difference. These are some general considerations. Annual forages will almost always be higher in digestible energy than will perennials. And I will emphasize at comparable stages of maturity. Cool season forages are typically going to be higher in protein than our warm season species. Legumes are going to be higher in protein and typically also higher in digestible energy than our grasses at comparable stages of maturity. Let's break this out a little more in the energy and protein basis. Annuals higher energy than perennials, legumes higher energy than grasses. Now, I'm saying cool season grasses and warm season grasses are equal in energy at comparable stages of maturity. Okay, now in the part of the United States and Canada where I most frequently work, if there are warm season grasses present, they are native warm season species, the tall grass prairie grasses. And that is where we really see this equality in energy. If, on the other hand, we are looking at tropical and subtropical grasses, very often, even at comparable stages of maturity, they will be lower in energy content than the cool season grasses. When we look at protein, annuals are almost always higher than perennials, legumes always higher than grasses, and cool season perennial grasses are almost always going to be higher than warm season perennial grasses. Thinking about the topic for this evening was called Grazing Management for Targeted Animal Performance. And if we are looking for high animal performance, annuals become an increasingly important part of the pasture program. They can extend the grazing season later into fall or autumn, depending what you call it. We can get cattle, sheep on pasture earlier in the spring, but a real key thing is they can provide finishing or dairy quality pasture when you don't normally expect to have it. So high animal performance, annuals are very important. Summer annual forages, they provide productive forage in midsummer. Dairy or finishing quality forage at a time when it is usually in short supply. When we look at trying to produce grass-fed beef in a warm season environment in the summer months, we are almost entirely dependent on annual warm season forages because the perennials we have available just cannot deliver the energy that we need. We can also take summer annual forages and carry them into the winter as dry cow feed. When we think about these annuals, when the forage is green and actively growing energy and protein, they are suitable for any class of livestock we want to throw out there. Lactating dairy cows, use of nannies, grass-fed beef. This is high octane feed right here. Maturity is a factor, just like we were talking about before. Here's a big difference. We've got a sorghum Sudan grass field here. So a warm season annual. If it were grazed at 30 inches tall, as we see on the left side of the photo, it is finishing quality feed. If we don't get to it, and it gets to this young lady, she's not a short person, but that's about 60 inch or 5 foot tall, 1.6 meter tall feed. It has gone from being finishing quality feed to being cow feed. We can look at some of the cool season forages like cereal rye that are finishing quality feed early, but they very quickly become just brown manure. One of the ways that we broaden the quality window diversity in these, we over here commonly call cocktail cover crops. One of the reasons that we put diversity in there is we have plants maturing at different times, and so it gives us a wider window of forage quality that we can harvest from. Each time we graze off an annual forage, basically we're going to restart that quality curve. So this pasture, this sorghum Sudan that was 60 inches tall, that was grazed off, it's going to tiller up from the bottom, send up some new shoots. There's also going to be some aerial tillers, but in 25 to 30 days, this is going to be carrying another crop of finishing quality feed. Plant part is our other component of forage quality. This is where selective grazing comes into play. I think everyone recognizes that leaves are more preferred grazing by animals than are the stems. That's simply because the leaves, that's where the goodies are. That's where the energy, the protein, the bioavailable minerals are. And that brings us to the idea of allowing animals first bites and second bites. So if we look at the plant part and think about only asking our animals to graze the top 20 to 30% of the plant, that is where we are going to maximize energy intake. If we ask them to graze lower down into the plant, take that second bite, We're looking at declining leaf stem ratio, and so the amount of digestible energy, available protein, bioavailable minerals are all going down. And then that third bite, really that third bite belongs to the plant, and you shouldn't be taking it anyway. This is illustration. This is done by my good friend Jason Roundtree, Dr. Jason Roundtree at Michigan State University. And it's just illustrating graphically looking at TDN on the right side of the graph and crude protein on the left side. The green bar is the top 1/3 of the plant. The red is the middle third. And then the blue is the bottom third of the plant. And this is all cool season forage here, and pretty well managed to keep it in a vegetative state. And once again, just really illustrates that the quality of the pasture is in the top part of it. Oh yeah, that's the 60% line here. That would be our separation between high quality forage and moderate quality forage. Typical use cereal grains and annual ryegrass. A lot of different winter annual legumes. These are ones commonly used in North America, I'm sure, in Australia, in Africa, South America, Europe, wherever we might have listeners or viewers from. There's other ones that I'm not familiar with, not on the list, but we like the mixture legumes, brassicas, other forbs in there. All of these have a role to play in producing high quality forage to get high performance out of our animals. Brassicas come on quickly, give us a high yield, sometimes in as little as 30 days. Most animals really enjoy eating this. Strip grazing them with electric fence like this is a good way to use it. Now, we have something in this part of the world that some of the viewers don't have, and that is winter. And brassicas are one of those feed sources that deteriorate very rapidly in the face of winter. So don't plant 1,000 acres of it expecting that you're going to graze your stock all winter long on this stuff, because it will go to mush. Summer annual grasses, corn, crabgrass, you know, all corn, crabgrass, by the way, is a digitaria. Corn is just a big warm season pasture grass, and we can use it that way. A lot of different summer annual legumes in the peas and lentils families. As I said, these warm season annuals, they're high in energy, moderate in protein during summer, great for pasture finishing, for dairy, for growing stockers at a high rate of gain. Later in the season, as sunlight intensity goes down, they're going to be much lower in energy, and they become more cow feed replacement heifers, dry dairy cows. With your grazing annuals, understand that they will grow very quickly. We need to understand how maturity affects animal performance, and we also need to figure out how to utilize them effectively. You don't want your summer annuals to be twice as tall as your cows to get effective use out of them. What I generally emphasize in grazing warm season annuals is knees to hip, knees to hip. Get stock on there before it's hip high, graze it down to knee high. And if you can keep these annuals in that knee to hip high range, they are very good quality feed, give us a great deal of performance. Now, a lot of people growing annuals, Hotel on the Plains Conference in Wichita, Kansas, a lot of that is about using cover crops and annual forages to build soil, and grazing is a secondary objective. So if you're trying to build soil organic matter and put biomass on the soil surface to protect it, what you leave behind is just as important consideration as what you're grazing off with your livestock. In a wet environment, we want to see at least a ton, so 2,000 pounds or 1,000 kilograms material left on the soil surface. In a dry environment, we'd like to see 1,000 pounds. If your cover crop only produces 900 pounds, I'll tell you what, it's hard to leave 1,000 pounds out there. So we might take 1/3 and leave 2/3. One thing to keep in mind as you're using these forages, the less residual that you leave, the poorer animal performance is going to be. So this balance of are you growing soil or are you growing livestock? It's something that needs to be considered. All right. So for those of you who don't know, yeah, I've written some books. You can find them at our website. And here's my contact information. If you want to get in touch, visit our website, see what American Grazing Lands is all about. And I'll turn it back to you, Carl, and we'll see about some Q&A.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jim. And just while on topic there, talking about no till on the plains, Wichita, Kansas. I've just been down there at the conference over the last 2 days, and talking about cover crops and so forth, and growing soil health. Doug Peterson, who was probably known by many, gave a fantastic presentation about that sort of ship starting to turn around a little bit, and a lot of papers were delivered about the incredible benefits beyond the soil, but from the production benefits and profitability benefits of introducing livestock into no-till and cover cropping scenarios. So it was fantastic to meet a bunch of MaiaGrazing customers over the last few days down there. There's a few people from Kansas on the call here, as well as Oklahoma, that are dropping us a line, which is good to know. But the first question, Jim, is to you, and it's from Justin, and it's, do you have any data on the long-term effect on the pasture sward and the soil organic matter of eating grass in phase 2 compared to allowing the grass to reach phase 3 prior to grazing? Over to you, Jim.
Okay, before I answer that, I want to ask the question, did we really go through that whole thing with my slides the size of a postage stamp?
No, I think that was just me, Jim. It was good for everyone else.
Okay, good. Woo. Okay. Regarding the long-term data of pasture grazed in phase 2 versus letting it go to phase 3, or grazing tall as some people would call it, again referring to Jason Roundtree at Michigan State University, they did that comparison in a study, and they were looking at net carbon gain and a number of other soil health factors in there. And the bottom line of that study was the grazing, putting cattle into the pasture high in phase 2, removing them low in phase 2, did sequester more carbon, and there's a whole list of other considerations they were looking at compared to the grazing tall with less frequent grazing. When I was in the research business, I left that in 2003, and the whole big movement in carbon that's driving so much now, that's only been in the last 10 to 15 years that's really come around. And so we were not measuring things that we should have been measuring for that 22 years that I was doing pasture research at Missouri. I think my observation, when I have tried to do the grazing tall, like I illustrated in that one slide where we had the fence going up the middle, and the left side was green and vegetative, and the right side fully mature. I did that deliberately that year, and I can say I saw no positive outcomes of letting the forage get to that more advanced maturity before we grazed it.
Thanks, Jim. Another one just shot through from John. I'm not exactly sure where John's writing in from. So John, feel free to let us know through the chat line. But John's question, either to Jim or Bart, or even both of you have a crack at it. What are the best visual keys to indicate full carbohydrate recovery on native tall grass warm season species? And John's from Kansas in the Flint Hills.
Okay, I'll hit that one first, and then you can follow up, Bart, if you want to add. We count leaves, and on the most of the native tall grasses, big blue, Indian grass, and even midgrass, side oats, I like about 5 leaves minimum. So before we would graze it the first time, we would want to have 5 true leaves emerge, and following a grazing event, if we were going to come back to it again, 5 leaves. In cool season grasses, we typically talk about 3 or 4 leaves. Warm seasons, we want a little more than that.
Thanks, Jim. Bart, do you have anything to add there? I'm not sure how much work that you've done in the Kansas Flint Hills.
No, I'm not sure that I can add very much there, but I think the principle I would agree with from Jim there.
Great, thanks, Bart. Next one was Terence, again from Kansas. We're getting pummeled from Kansas. This is fantastic.
Ain't nothing else to do there.
Especially when the no-till conference finished yesterday. This is for you, Jim. Are improved pastures worth the investment if you're already on top of your grazing management practices?
And that is a good question. All right. If you are, because he's from Kansas, I'm going to answer it this way. If you are on native grass and doing a good job of managing that native grass, keeping it healthy, vigorous, productive, no way would I want to replace native grass with so-called improved pasture. If, on the other hand, you're in a location where there's some, bluegrass, white clover, infected fescue, you can put the very best grazing management you want on that, and it is not going to come close to what the productivity of an improved grass legume mixture on that same land would do. And I would say, yeah, absolutely. If that's the comparison we're looking at, then yeah, go for the improved pasture. But if we're talking about health, comparing that to healthy native grass, no, I would not make that change.
Bart, what do you think on this one? Do you have something to add there?
Oh, yeah, look, it's a great question. I think all too often, way too much capital is spent, working capital is spent on improving pastures when both the grazing management nor the underlying soil asset is capable of supporting it for anything longer than 18 months to maybe 3 years. And so that then puts a load of pressure on the system to keep going through that cycle. But where the grazing management is on the money, almost, well, it depends where you are, obviously, but very often seed will move in, will have been sown 20 years ago or 2 years ago, and succession takes over, and we see those more desirable species come through simply because they have a competitive advantage and the production goes up with them. But it does come back to the capacity of that land to support the nutrient requirements of those higher order species and the grazing management to sustain it then. But I think there's no two ways about it. When you have got the management that can do that, you will gain more kilos, more pounds from that higher order species.
Yeah, I want to come back on that. And, I agree completely with that, Bart. You always need to take care of the grazing management first. And very often, I can go into a pasture and I have a real good idea whether just changing the grazing management is going to fix that pasture or not. And many, many, many times, that is all that it needs, is just appropriate grazing management. Coming back to this idea of seeding an improved pasture, my view is largely that seeding a pasture is something you do once in your lifetime. And if you put adapted species there and have effective grazing management, like I talked about at the beginning of this, that pasture should be there, for your children.
Thanks, Jim. I've got another one here from Pardon me for a moment, I've just lost my place on the page here. From Peter and Katrina, back in Australia. I'm actually, I'm in the US at the moment myself. Great to hear from you, Peter and Katrina. I won't give your surname away. Question is, we're in a strong Mediterranean environment, typically 7 to 8 months dry annual rainfall, average 500 mils running sheep. What modifications do we need to make to maximise pasture performance and profit in a cell grazing system? I think this is probably a good one for everyone. Start with you, Bart.
Sorry, Cole, you just caught me here. So, so the question is, I've got a very strongly Mediterranean climate, therefore a very biannual season where it's hot to trot when it's on, and it's cool to trot when it's on, and it's hot and shut down when it's off. So therefore, managing that stocking rate to carrying capacity becomes all the more important, and the challenges of keeping on top of the allocation of feed quality becomes pretty challenging, because you've got the full spectrum of change through the 12-month season, and it really does come down to managing stock class demands based on life cycle and groups that are in the enterprise.
Yeah, thanks, Bart. And I'll just jump back in there. Peter and Katrina just added something there to that question. Is the perennial species are very difficult to be profitable because they're too difficult to maintain.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't hear that. My Wi-Fi dropped out, I'm afraid.
Oh, Peter and Katrina just added further to above, we have found that perennial species aren't profitable because they're too difficult to maintain. You've probably answered that. Jim, did you have something?
Yeah. The Mediterranean climate that I'm, of course, most familiar with is our California coast. And an awful lot of that landscape has been degraded to annual, less than desirable grassland species. You do find areas that are still perennial native pastures, and in some case, perennial seeded pastures. But about the only place you find that is where the owners or managers have been working for 30 or 40 years using holistic principles, very tight time-controlled grazing, and they have either been able to maintain the existing natives or they were able to create perennial pastures. No, it was not easy, but they made a long-term commitment to accomplish that. So I'm not going to say that it's impossible to have profitable perennial species in a Mediterranean climate, but it is very hard work to get there.
Thanks, Jim. One's come in from Nathan from Wyoming, and the questions are really rolling in now. So we're conscious of everyone's time. So we'll answer a few more questions. As long as people want to hang in there, we're more than happy to stay. Nathan from Wyoming asks, any differences in long-term soil health, structure, and therefore animal health when grazing irrigated pasture, high-density fast rotation, specifically comparing flood irrigation to sprinkler irrigation? And Nathan's really appreciative of everyone's time, so you're more than welcome, Nathan.
Hi, Nate. I think I know who this is. Yeah, there's big differences between flood and sprinklers, and I'll specifically refer to pivots because you've been here and you know that's what we do. The huge difference between flood and sprinklers is the return time that we can deliver with sprinklers compared to flooding. And so we can keep grass growing in a good aggressive state easier under sprinklers than we can with flood. And then if we are doing high density grazing and like on a pivot, we might be coming back in 25 to 35 days to graze it again. Flood, usually not that short a time. But with flood irrigation, we need at least a week of drying out time before we put the cattle in there to graze it. With the sprinklers, it's easier to regulate the amount of water and reduce our drying out time there. So all of those factors are contributing to how much root growth we can get, what the biological activity is. And I think one of the things you might be asking about with flood irrigation and keeping the ground saturated, what are we really doing to desirable soil microbes? I don't think it's good. I believe with properly managed sprinklers, we can keep soil alive and functioning much, much better. No hard data on that, but that's what it appears to be.
Yeah, and I think you're right there, Jim. You do know Nate. He says, thanks, Jim, and hello. And he's just touched on your point there. He said really trying to limit the ponding and soil saturation as much as possible, still considering the financial investments.
Just love to throw in there, Cole, if I could.
Yeah, go for it.
I think Jim's covered it, but it just does bear reiterating that water costs money. One of the highest costs on irrigated farms is the electricity to get the water up and over, and it's a big cost at the end of the day. And the things that I've really come across the most are that we just overdo it, whether it's flood or sprinkler, but definitely both actually, unless there's a bit of investment in monitoring probes and so on, so that we know what the readily available water is on a daily basis, and it all just flows out the bottom. People will almost always, if not always, overwater, which then leads to these issues in the first place, which then puts more pressure on the soil chemistry being better over here than over there to be able to respond to that anaerobic condition for a period of time, which then dictates all these other things that Jim referred to. So it's a huge opportunity, I reckon, for the irrigated pasture sector.
Thanks, Bart. I'll jump to Travis. Not sure where Travis is calling in from, so feel free to let us know, Travis. To all panelists, what tips do you have for evaluating forage or pasture usage levels in bigger pastures that may not show even usage?
Why don't you go for that, Bart, first?
Kyle, I'm afraid you're going to have to repeat the question for my slowness.
What tips do you have for evaluating forage or pasture usage levels in bigger pastures that may not show even usage? And Travis is dialing in from Montana. Great to have you here.
I'm just trying to picture the situation and the scenario. So bigger pastures meaning higher dry matter levels.
5,000 acres.
Extensive.
Each pasture, 5,000 acres.
Expansive areas.
Gotcha. So in extensive areas. Yeah, fair enough. Look, great question. And I guess, yeah, so large, low intensity grazing, and ultimately that's the issue, right? We've got focused grazing or higher density grazing, I'm assuming, therefore, in resulting in uneven grazing, which is really what you're talking about. And that's always going to be difficult. The brave new world that's coming, where we'll be able to see a satellite image that tells us that this corner of the 5,000 acres is 1,500 pounds or thereabouts in kilos versus half that over here, taking into account the variation through tree cover, veg cover, and so on. That's coming. We're looking pretty hard at that at the moment. I think that's ultimately where this is going to go. In the short term, it's hard. Short answer is it's hard. It's about human calibration and getting your eye in, and ultimately having good data flowing in to do with what the actual animal units consumed has been in that pasture or that paddock for a period of time, because it's a known thing based on the size of the herd, how long it was in there for, class of animal and so on. We know how many kilos have been consumed on a daily basis or a graze basis. So therefore, it's a matter of calibration, I'm afraid, at the end of the day, and that's the beauty and the art of being the grazier. Pretty lax answer, but that's what I'm going to go with.
How about you, Jim?
All right, Travis, I'm going to give you the primitive suggestion. In these pastures, if you go to where the stock are getting their water, and right away from there, and just look at the pasture, you're probably going to see that it's used more closer to water than it is further away. And you just ride from there and go to that point where you say, they ought to be using more of this. And you see what that distance is. And what that is telling you is the spacing at which you should be developing additional stock water points. Stock water development on rangeland. We have had cases in Montana where we have quadrupled the specifically winter grazing off of winter rangeland through stock water development. Also in summer situations. And it almost always pays. And usually it's a pretty good return on investment. But until we have the technology that Bart was talking about, that you're going to be able to pinpoint that distribution pattern, just riding away from your stock water point and determining, with your own eye that, man, they should have used more of this. From that point back to your stock water, double that distance, and that's the frequency at which you should try to develop stock water locations on that range unit.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jim. Got Brad and Jill sending a message in from Hawaii, not sure which island, but one for you, Bart, and this sort of stems to, I guess, the functionality of MaiaGrazing itself, going back to managing different livestock classes and their demands and so forth. But the question is, does MaiaGrazing handle different livestock classes? If so, how does it track performance over time?
Okay, yeah, great to talk to Hawaii, eh? Yeah, it certainly does. We track all livestock to class, i.e. stock class, and through to enterprise, in fact. So the data model has a bit more depth to it so that we can not just track the steers and their weight gain or their total gross production over a period of time or between 2 points in time, whether it's a financial year or calendar year or what have you. But also the difference between, for argument's sake, the bred steers versus the trade steers, or the adjustment contract steers versus the those at home, and that's pretty valuable. So yeah, look, we certainly take those all grazing data, all weight gain data, all animal unit days consumed data, tracks through and is linked to those two primary keys, which is the enterprise and the stock class. So absolutely, and it's a pretty fundamental piece of knowledge to have in your armory when evaluating the difference between enterprises and classes within enterprises, or even just either way. You can slice it and dice it, and it is a very, very valuable piece of information to know when you're evaluating how you're going and whether or not you should in fact be doing what you're doing. Good question.
Thanks, Bart. And Brittany from Missouri. So, Jim, you know a fair bit about Missouri, I hear. Based on your experience, how well does the average ranch in the US handle balancing nutrient needs of stock classes with the available pasture?
Very poorly.
Well, there you go. I think the same probably could be said the world over. That's why we're all here tonight.
Sorry.
Keep the questions rolling in, guys. It's been an hour and a half. I think we'll probably call it a morning, an afternoon, an evening. We've even got some people joining us at ungodly hours. You wouldn't believe it, but it's been fantastic to have you all. I think we'll just flick on to another slide there. Just if you'd like to learn more about MaiaGrazing and you're not a customer yet, we'd love to speak to you. We'd love to share more about the application and how it may apply to your ranch and your position of grazing management, whether you're just starting out or whether you've got some very advanced systems in place and already using tools. There's something here for everyone. We'd love to learn more about your operations. So whether it's really, just taking that first step or right at the other end, looking at how to really balance the dynamic stocking rate with the carrying capacity of the land, graze planning, forecasting, replanning, or just really whether it's very basic record keeping and managing your grazing records, or just managing your livestock inventory. There's a whole lot of reasons why people start with MaiaGrazing, but our overall goal is really to have the rancher in mind, to be able to balance their stocking rate to carrying capacity, make as early decisions as possible, so you can gain as maximum efficiency and utilization from your pastures year in, year out, and be ahead of the curve. We've just got a few more questions coming in. There's another slide there that tells about some of the upcoming major events that we'll be at as well, which we'll just run in the background, and we'll just open up a couple more questions. So for those that want to hang in there, please do. We've got Webb here, Webb Junior. If you have cool season perennials that become over matured during the spring flush before you can get them, and previously grazed pastures that are fully recovered, what do you do? Should you return to the recovered vegetative pastures and mow the mature pasture? Jim?
All right, this will sound bad coming from the guy who wrote Kick the Hay Habit. So Webb, if you are living in a location where you are using hay to winter on, then I would say those pastures that have become mature, mow them for hay, mow them at a taller than typical cutter bar height so that they'll recover more quickly, and take your grazing back to the earlier grazed pastures that have recovered. If you are not making hay, I am not a fan of just bush hogging pastures down. I'd probably push the cattle to utilize the best feed out of the mature pastures maybe for another couple weeks, and then go to the earlier grazed pastures.
How about you, Bart?
Yeah, look, it's a great question. It depends where you are and just how sensitive these things are, from a dairy back to something a bit more extensive. But there's no two ways about it. You'll lose production if you force the animal, or the high value class of animal, to go into that that feed that you're a bit late for. And yeah, I'd be walking past it, and whether I can mow it, put it to silage, or actually just leave it in the paddock for a future time for another class of animal, or when it maybe it's a sanctuary for that next feed gap. But it's ultimately a good problem to have, and great thinking.
Great, thanks, Bart. And another one's come in from Steve. Not sure where Steve's from. Feel free to drop us another note there, as it can always provide just that little bit more context for Jim and for Bart when answering the questions. But the question is, where do we pull carrying capacity from initially, and how much can be gained from good management over time?
I'll tackle that one. And I'll answer the second part first. In my view and experience, and I've been, involved in grazing pastures 40 plus years now in the U.S., most pastures in the U.S. are managed at 1/3 to 50% of their carrying capacity. So that's how much potential improvement there is. As far as Steve, if you are in the U.S., the Web Soil Survey, USDA Web Soil Survey site, you can go there, map your farm out, get a tremendous amount of information about soils on your farm, including what the expected productivity is. So for me, in my consulting business, that's almost always my starting point on seeing what the expected carrying capacity of a property is.
Thanks, Jim. Bart, did you have anything to add there?
Yeah, sure. Look, it's a pretty critical number. It's a pretty critical benchmark. It's a pretty critical part of the deal, obviously. And, you know, I guess that it is a good question because a lot of people just don't really have that sense of confidence to start with. A, because maybe they haven't got the data. B, because they just haven't been familiar with it at all previously. And so the best place to start there is just pulling out some very rough rules of thumb. You know, what has the farm run previously, and then calibrate that to long-term average rate of precipitation is how we would go about it, and following the principles of Stan Parsons and RCS. I think that's a great way to start the ball rolling, just to get yourself in the ballpark, and then the data will tell the story, because, you know, very often that ballpark number will be off the money by maybe 5 to 20%, and then the data will tell the story, and the data will come from tracking those things that we mentioned earlier on, grazes, inventory, and precipitation, and it just falls out the bottom. That's the beauty of it. And to answer the second part of the question, which is a good one, totally agree with Jim. There is so much upside in grazing. It's just mind-boggling. The ability to take a farm and add 50% and up to more than 100% to its carrying capacity, or its ability to convert sun and moisture into grass, consumed grass, is constantly astounding to me and us, because it just happens, and it's a result of management, and that's where the opportunities are. So it's a great thing. It's a fantastic thing.
Great, thanks, Bart. And I guess just to provide a little bit of context, thanks for sending in your location, Steve. It's in very high rainfall, lower southeast, South Australia, SA or South Africa, but I think lower southeast, South Australia, that's how it's referred to. So probably down around Millicent, Kingston southeast, Mount Gambier, Narracourt area, limestone coast, for those on the call that will look that up. I'm not sure if that everything both of you said still relevant for everyone, regardless of location, but that's great to know, Steve. Thank you. John, I think this is just in, John's on the line here. Jim just responding to that soil survey information, I believe. Does the soil survey production estimates show the full potential of a site, or is it more reflective of current/historic range health?
It does not show the full potential, because when they come up with their range productivity estimates, it tends to be based on the current state of that range site, and also it's in the context of typical management, which is either set stock or very slow rotation. I use the soil survey estimate as a baseline beginning point. What we generally see is once producers have implemented a good planned grazing program, we expect to see at least 20 to 40% higher production than what the soil survey is projecting.
Great, thanks very much, Jim. Keep the questions coming in, guys, on the email. You've hopefully got our details from the details that were on the screen earlier. Jim, of course, is going to be the Stockman Grass Farmer Grassroots of Grazing School and the Intensive Grazing School in early February. Just next week, we'll have the team also down at the San Antonio, Texas, at the NCBA conference. Jim's also coming to Australia to come to our one-day annual field day. Last year we had over 300 graziers from all over Australia visit us there. You can see a bit of the lineup on the screen there, including Christine Jones, Bart, Toby Grogan, Dennis Hoiberg, David Marsh, Nick and Alex Anderson. Fantastic. Of course, Bart Davidson, that goes without saying. fantastic lineup. We're looking forward to a huge event there. A few days later, we're down in Wagga Wagga, New South Wales, in partnership with Merino Link and New South Wales Local Land Services, putting on a grazing management day focused on the merino wool industry in Australia. A few weeks' time down in Denver at the Society of Range Management Conference, Grass-Fed Exchange later on. Things are happening all the time. If anyone's got ideas of where you'd like to hear us, or ideas for a webinar, or have an audience who'd like to hear from us and Jim and Bart and others in the network, please let us know, and stay tuned for more in the MaiaGrazing Scholars webinar series. We've got some pretty exciting speakers coming up over the next months. So please ensure that you're in touch and stay tuned. But if there's nothing else, thanks very much, everyone, and happy grazing.
You're right.
All right, thank you, everyone.